tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please remember to drop a sub, drop a like, and leave your thoughts down below in the comments. With that, we will see you guys in the podcast. Welcome, Dr. Davidson, to the World XP podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on. I know I took one of your classes when I was a freshman at Mary Washington all the way back in the day. So it's nice to reconnect a bit and get your thoughts on some of the things that are going on in the world, given that seems to be lots of confusion for most normal people who don't live and breathe this stuff all the time. So really excited to get your thoughts on some of these things.
Yeah, I'm excited to have the conversation.
So for those listening who don't know you, you are a professor of international affairs at Mary Washington. I guess if you want to go and expand on the introduction a little bit, just for those listening.
Sure. So I've been at Mary Washington this will be my 21st year. So I've been doing this for a little while. I have a PhD and a master's degree from Georgetown University and an undergrad that's in government, basically political science, and an undergraduate degree in political science from UC Berkeley. In addition to being a professor at Mary Washington, recently was made a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in their New American Engagement Initiative, which is a mouthful. It just means that I'm a little bit more engaged in kind of contemporary American foreign policy stuff, and not just academic writing and teaching.
Gotcha.
So research, which we'll talk about a lot of different things today, but my research, broadly defined, is on alliances. So I've written a couple of different books with different sort of takes on alliances, and looking at different aspects of alliances, but broadly defined alliances. And I've got more of a regional specialization in Western Europe, but I dabble a little bit in stuff outside of Europe as well.
Gotcha. So I think that's a great place to start. You do have, is this your most recent book, America's Entangling Alliances?
Correct.
So the link for that will be in the description for those listening if you guys are interested. But can you go ahead and give us sort of a rundown of the book? And then I think that will take us into a lot of the topics that we will touch on. So it seems like a good place to start. So what is sort of an overarching summary of what you've written about and how you got interested in in this area specifically?
Yeah, so the idea for the book came out of sort of the rise of the Tea Party movement, and then as I actually had already started the book, really the kind of more prominent role that Donald Trump played in first becoming the Republican nominee and then winning the 2016 election. And specifically on the topic of alliances, because there was not so much Trump himself, but a lot of the background to those conversations was that the natural state for the United States was one of not being engaged in alliances, right? That the founding fathers, and there's references to George Washington's farewell address and Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, where Jefferson argued against, quote unquote, entangling alliances. And so a lot of people, both some professional historians, but certainly lots of amateur historians, took that little bit and said, okay, that means that essentially the US's default is not engaging in alliances, and we did something really crazy after World War II, but boy, that was a mistake, and so we should kind of get out of it, right? And I already had a sense from my knowledge of U.S. diplomatic history, that was maybe not correct. And then there's also been the introduction. That was something that was really important in my book, is for the kind of premise or the starting point of my book, that we can think about alliances much more broadly, and should think about alliances much more broadly than just treaties, right? So yes, there are treaties like the North Atlantic Treaty that established NATO in, what was then North Atlantic Treaty in 1949. Probably the most famous alliance that's out there. Yes, there's a treaty binding the United States and Japan, for example. But there are also other alliances that we know today and we treat as alliances that are not based in treaties. So the U.S. relationship with Israel, for example, no treaty there. So that's the first part, is it's beyond treaties. And then in the book, I looked at really three different kinds of alliances, and that's really the first contribution the book made. Yes, there are these defense pacts, which are commitments by the United States to defend another state against attack, but there are also military coalitions. So again, something that's not controversial at all is that when the United States entered World War I and entered World War II, it was entering these great power military coalitions to fight wars. People recognize that. Well, why wouldn't that be considered an alliance, right? If an alliance is, the definition that I use in the book, drawing on other scholars, is that it's an agreement to further your security, right? Well, why did the U.S. enter World War I and World War II? It did so to further its own security. And then there's a third category of alliances that I look at in the book, which are security partnerships. So you want to think about those as maybe like alliances light, so sort of alliance, minus. So there are lots of coordination and cooperation, arms sales, military basing agreements, maybe joint training and exercises. And those have been another important feature. So the first contribution that the book makes, is to really just point out that there have been, and I document 34 different alliances across the history of the United States. But then the second thing, getting a little bit more sophisticated, so I'll just throw this out really briefly, is that there have alliances that serve different purposes at different phases of American power. So, for example, in the 19th century, really starting with the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the United States had just become a regional power, so it had just become kind of, both with interests in the Americas, but also with the ability to kind of protect and defend those interests. And so it engaged in a variety of defense pacts in the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine, the Tyler Doctrine relative to Hawaii, the Bidlack-Mallarino Treaty, that haven't gotten a lot of prominence, but were really important in terms of defending its regional interests, right? So that's going to be very different than the kind of agreements that the United States entered into in the unipolar era, for example, that we've been in since the end of the Cold War, where alliances, instead of like defending these little, like kind of not little, but these regional interests, like, maritime commerce and naval security, in the unipolar world that we've been in for the past 30 years, the United States is engaging in alliances for the reason of essentially burden sharing, helping out with a lot of its kind of global, hegemon type obligations. So very different reasoning at different phases of power. I'll leave it at that. That was kind of a
Gotcha. No, it's all good. It all makes sense. So I think you touched on NATO, and that given the current situation in Eastern Europe at the moment, so I have two questions actually. One, it seems like right when it happened, everybody was talking about it, and then all of a sudden, people kind of just stopped. Like you don't really hear much about it anymore. One of the reasons that you hear for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that NATO is getting too close to the borders. I don't, right, having not followed this the way that you do, I have no idea if that holds any merit. But given the research what little research I did, it seems like there could be some semblance of truth there. So from the perspective of the alliances that we have, NATO and the other agreements, whether they're in treaty or not, like Alliance Light, like you mentioned, what is actually going on here from both the Russian perspective and the U.S. perspective? Because it seems like we being the U.S. are kind of half helping. We're sending money, but I don't really understand why. And so can you kind of touch on that and sort of what's going on? And if you have some knowledge of the current situation on the ground, that would be great also, but just from a broader perspective as well.
Yeah, so maybe let me take your initial. So it seems like there's kind of three things there.
Yeah.
The way I would break it down, one is trying to get some handle on the reasons for Russia's invasion, and then get why is the U.S. responding the way that it is, and a little bit about how the U.S. is responding.
Yep.
So let me start. So starting with Russia, certainly you are right that one of the things, of course, Vladimir Putin and the Russian government has said a variety of different things about why they're involved in this, denazification, right? They and on the one hand, certainly there have been right-wing extremist elements in particular divisions in Ukraine, but overwhelmingly, I think, and objectively, there's really no validity to the idea that there are Nazi elements, and certainly Zelensky himself being Jewish, kind of suggests that that's incorrect. Now, this argument about NATO, on the one hand, I think certainly there are some more credible arguments that can be made there in terms of the fact that Putin and Russia are really just reacting to NATO encroachment, NATO expansion. The academic John Mearsheimer has essentially kind of made a more sophisticated version of that argument. I tend to think that argument doesn't hold a lot of water, and here's why. Going back to 2008, when NATO and the United States basically forced the NATO members to say that someday Ukraine would join NATO. From that date, before that date, and all the way up to today, major NATO members, so Germany and France are the two most famous of them, have said they do not support Ukraine joining NATO, right? That was the same in 2008. That was the same in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine. And that was the same on February 24th of this year when Russia invaded Ukraine. There was nothing looking like it was going to change there. No prospect that Ukraine would possibly join NATO because, the way NATO works is everybody basically has to sign off on it. And it'd be one thing, I think, if it was like, imagine that like Albania said, right, okay, maybe everybody else gangs up on Albania, but these are too big, and they're just the most, maybe not maybe the loudest, but they've been very public in the lead up to this process. So there was nothing about to change, or nothing even like you can't even look 5 to 10 years in the future and say, well, if Ukraine does X, Y, and Z, that they could eventually join NATO. It just wasn't going to happen. So it does not explain why Putin would do this at this particular point in time. I tend to think, and what I've seen in most of the, I think the better analysis, first of all, we don't know for sure because it's really what's in Putin's head. I mean, it's not
sure,
right.
It's all speculation, that really,
right?
Educated speculation,
right? So this is about sort of kind of trying to, as much as possible, recreate a Russian sphere of influence like existed in the Soviet Union. So pushing back on the idea that any of the countries essentially around Russia should be independent, and or even like leaning toward the West, right? So kind of trying to recreate that Soviet grandeur, combined with, and this is where the timing I think is important, Putin thinking that he, after the 2014 actions there, that he would just, it would be a cakewalk essentially, right? I believe he probably was under the mistaken impression from some intelligence and analysis he was getting from his military advisors that it was going to be a lot easier, and that's why they initially tried to essentially take the whole country, and then only when they failed pretty miserably in that did they fall back to the goals that they're pursuing now. And I think most people would say that where we are now is that we're sort of in a stalemate. The indications that I'm reading are that on kind of a weekly basis, it looks like Ukraine has a bit of a leg up in terms of, but it really depends on where you're looking. I wouldn't expect anything major to shift in the near future. Now, why is the U.S. doing what it's doing, and what is it doing? Well, first of all, what the U.S. is doing is providing Ukraine with a fair bit of military aid. We're up to about $9 billion. So that's pretty significant, chunk of change in less than a year. just yesterday announced another 9 billion excuse me, not 9 billion, sorry, another billion to get a 9 billion figure. And I just read something today about an additional 800 million. So that would get you close to 10 billion total, dealing with things like demining. I don't know whether they're going to count that as military aid and so forth. But the stuff yesterday was artillery and those sorts of things. So very clearly military aid and designed to essentially, because this has become essentially an artillery war between Ukraine and Russia, to trying to bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities there. And now, so just one real quick additional point there. What is the U.S. not doing? I mean, I think the Biden administration has tried really hard, and I think they've been pretty successful so far at not going so far that they provoke sort of Russian retaliation on the United States or Russian retaliation on NATO members. In a way, it's fascinating that what you've had happen is the U.S. and all these NATO countries are pouring aid, military aid, and sophisticated firepower into Ukraine through NATO member countries, and Russia hasn't reached out against them yet. So, they've tried to kind of find a line in terms of both the volume, but I think more importantly, the kind of aid that they're providing. So they haven't given Ukraine lots of things that would allow it to go on the offensive. I suspect there's lots of backroom deals where they're telling the Ukrainians, look, do not use, we know this from some of the reporting, do not use these artillery systems to actually hit Russian territory in any kind of consistent, sophisticated way. So they're trying really hard to limit that and avoid. So this is, for example, there was this discussion about having a no-fly zone early on.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was really smart for the Biden administration to say, no, we're not going to do that, because that risks the United States getting into an air war with Russia. So why is it doing what it's doing? Well, I think there's really two factors here to be thinking about. They're both, well, maybe three. The first one, and I think I'm just going to put them in the order that I think is their order of importance based on what we know, and that is weakening Russia, right? The U.S. didn't cause this war. The U.S., I'm quite sure the Biden administration didn't want this war, but given that it's happened, and particularly given that Russia has struggled as much as it has, I think the Biden administration, and they've said this both publicly, and then there's been kind of repeated background reporting on this as well, that they're really looking at this as an occasion to essentially cut Russia off at the knees, and thus reduce the likelihood that they try to do anything like this in the foreseeable future. And parenthetically, I think that's exactly the right thing to be doing, right? As long as you can do that without getting into, some sort of nuclear conflagration, we can talk about that in a bit. I think it's the smart move, because they've repeatedly shown that they're willing to do this. Now, in addition, you've got a pretty serious, I mean, this is, one of, maybe not the most, but one of the most flagrant violations of rules, norms of international sovereignty since World War II. So that's kind of important. And then you've got the humanitarian crisis as well. So, there's kind of this moral outrage and kind of a sense that we need to reset the international or defend international norms as well. But I tend to think that first factor is probably the single most, important factor in terms of why the United States is doing what it's doing.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And one of the follow-on questions to that would be, how do they know where the line is between, like, it's not exactly a secret that we're giving them like loads of money, and at the same token, to maybe, like you said, less important, but we've kind of shown, I think, maybe to a lesser extent with the withdrawal in Afghanistan and some of our other actions, regardless of administration, that we're kind of, I guess, we're not enforcing the international norms as much as we used to. And so how much is there this like balancing act between showing like we're still here and we're still gonna like stand up for people, and at the same time not provoking into a more hot war with Russia? Because I think a lot of people here are the people that I have spoken to that are in my age group are kind of tired of us being in like random places all over the place and like, oh, I had such and such friend that was a Marine and he was sent to insert random country here, and it's like, why are they like? So there's that sentiment as well. I get there's a lot in that, but kind of I guess to boil it down to one, how are they deciding what, or you might not, I mean, to speculate, how are they kind of towing the line of being, yes, we're still here, well, with public sentiment being as it is without provoking at the same time? How is that balancing act kind of playing out? And how do you foresee it playing out as we continue? Because this doesn't look like it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Right, right, good. Well, so I think I would separate what you just asked into two parts. So there's part about how do you keep it from escalating, and where do you draw that line? And all we can really say is that, again, what they've done so far has seemed to have done a pretty good job of that. I mean, I don't think, from everything that I gather, we've gotten close to the point where there's a real risk that the US or NATO are going to get into direct conflict with Russia. If there was I think one of the things that's been important is, well, one that I said before, right, which is a limitation on not just a limitation on the kinds of weapon systems. So not giving Ukraine lots of things that they could use easily to go and attack Russia. So a lot of discussion, for example, earlier on about fighter jets. Well, that would allow you, right? That would be one thing. You can use them defensively, but you can also use them pretty easily offensively, right? So that's one possibility there in terms of the kinds of weapon systems that we're giving Ukraine, but also I think a lot of guidance to them saying, look, guys, behind closed doors, if you end up doing X, Y, and Z and you start blowing up targets in Russia, then we might have to reconsider a little bit. I suspect there's a lot of those conversations happening.
Is this acceptable for Russia, this level of aid at the moment? Like, I mean, we can't really tell, really.
Exactly. That's a really good point. But it does seem like, in a way, so I guess let's imagine a couple of different scenarios. Let's imagine a scenario where, Ukraine suddenly starts to really, essentially kick them out of all the parts of Ukraine that they currently control. Because currently Putin has sort of a face-saving, right? He's gained some territory relative to the start of the war. I think that might shift a little bit if things were going the other way in terms of his need to do something. I suspect this is because of the nuclear element to all of this, the fact that both Russia has nuclear weapons, but also the United States has nuclear weapons, that I think Russia's going to be real cautious in terms of what it does if it wants to signal that NATO or the West has gone too far. So if they get to that point, I think they're going to be pretty cautious in terms of how they do it. So one of the things that I've been expecting all along, for example, that hasn't really happened yet is, a stray missile or a stray plane ends up shooting down, some either, U.S. aircraft or, right, they've been pretty good at avoiding that sort of stuff. But if the Russians wanted to send a signal, they could do something kind of small like that to say, like, look, guys, you're hitting the limit here. There's probably some diplomatic exchanges along those lines as well. That's I would imagine and expect that that's the case. Now, on your other point, because I do think that there's something really important that needs to be said here as well, which is and I've been saying this actually in a couple of different places for a while now. I suspect that your impression when you're talking to people your age is the broader societal reaction. So I think that is exactly indicative of what's happening and what you said at the outset of the discussion about Ukraine, which is that over time, and we see this historically with crises like this, right? No matter how big something is at a particular moment, a foreign crisis, over time, people get sick of it, right? Unless it's affecting them directly. And in this case, the only way it's affecting Americans directly is with higher gas prices, which they don't like, right? But it doesn't tell, in other words, that doesn't tell them to help Ukraine. That just tells them, like, why the heck is it bothering me? Like, why do I keep having to pay more for gas, right? So, and I do think that moral outrage is going to continue to decline, right? We could expect it to continue to decline. And so over time, that's going to continue to erode the political support for US aid to Ukraine, right? You can get away with, and that's, as I said, yesterday, announcing another $1 billion. There's a day is going to come in the not too distant future where the Congress is going to say, right? And it might be, this is another important part of our landscape. So you've got the general public sentiment, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that's really important, I alluded to it before, is the Trump wing of the Republican Party now. And the way that they interpret or see the world, right, is through this quotes here, but America First lens, which from their perspective essentially says, if it's not directly serving our interest, then why are we doing it? Okay. Some of those people also tend to not see Russia as a threat so much. So I know there has been a bit of a split on the Ukraine question in the Republican Party, with some people taking a more, and particularly members of Congress, the House of Representatives, some people in the House taking more, some Republicans in the House taking a more kind of like, not my problem take on it, right? Well, let's imagine that Republicans win the midterm elections in November, and then they control a majority of the House. All this funding has to go through the House, so we could then expect there to be maybe less funding, because even if, let's say, half or 2/3 of the Republicans still are in favor of funding and they can get some Democrats behind them, right, they still probably are going to have to cut deals relative to other issues and those sorts of things. So I would expect over time, I think, first of all, the sentiment that you are, hearing among your friends is, and this sort of general kind of decline in terms of how much attention people are paying to this is going to continue, and that's going to over time erode the U.S. support for Ukraine.
So at that point, I don't know the split between U.S. funding versus NATO funding or how that would all work, but I would imagine that if we stopped funding or providing aid, I guess it depends on how much Russia has been weakened. Because that was the other thing that when this whole thing first started, I was like, well, they're going to get steamrolled just because of what you tend to think of the Russian military, like without doing any research. But it seemed much like Putin there's been some miscalculations on that it would be a cakewalk for them just from that side, because a certain amount of percentage of Ukrainians identify as Russian and like all these other things. I think there was that sentiment from the US side that like it wasn't gonna be any sort of competition. And so given the fact that that's happened, is this a miscalculation on the Ukrainian strength or a overestimation of the Russian strength, or both? And I guess to follow on with that, is there sort of a line where the Biden administration or whoever is controlling the funding has decided like we've weakened them enough, public sentiment has waned, now it's fine to like back off? Are all those things sorts of in play as well? And I guess the overarching question I'm really curious about is like, is the Russian military just not as strong as we thought it was? And if that's the case, then it seems the overall right, the unipolar aspect, like looking like it was going to change again, seems to kind of be, maybe it's just like with China and the US and Russia's kind of lower than we thought. Is that kind of accurate, or what are your thoughts on those things?
Yeah, no, I think first of all, I mean, to go to where you said at the end there, I when I look at the world today and I look at hard indicators of power like GDP, defense spending, the U.S. is still by far in the lead on both of those. China's defense spending is about 1/3 of the United States's, right? Their GDP is growing and projected to reach U.S. levels in nominal GDP terms by 2030, right? So China's in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any doubt about that. I would characterize the world we're in as somewhat bipolar, and the reason is that China doesn't really have the military capability to project outside of Asia in any sophisticated way, right? So they can definitely cause a lot of trouble in Asia. They're doing it right now in Taiwan, but they don't have the ability to project globally at this point. Okay, Russia is, and I think and then I'll come to the Ukraine war, but just in terms of the indicators, Russia's defense spending, on the one hand, stands out relative to lots of other countries and countries in Europe in particular. But Russia's defense spending is a tenth of what the United States is.
Mm.
Russia's economy, Russia's GDP is the size of Italy's. Okay? Is anybody talking about Italy as a great power? No.
No.
The reason why we talk about, I mean, the one thing that Russia has that those actors don't have of real significance is its nuclear arsenal. It has a nuclear arsenal, right? So we need to take that seriously. But I think, and it has shown its ability to engage in, short, no holds barred military action, like it did in Syria, right? It did engage in pretty successful operations in Syria. It's got this Wagner group that it can use to engage in kind of mercenary, small scale, mercenary activities to overthrow governments and things like that. But it doesn't have anything like great power military power projection capabilities. And there's lots of reasons for that. So, I think that some of the best analysts of the Ukraine war, would give you probably a 10-point list of all the things that the Ukraine war has shown that they've done wrong. And certainly some of those things are mistakes that you could correct, right? So in that initial phase, it was like everything was wrong.
Yeah.
They had 8 different lines of attack, which is the dumbest thing you could ever do in a situation like that. But the bottom line is, yes, Russia is not in any way on the same level as China or certainly not the United States.
Was this more of a function of Ukraine being stronger than everybody thought it was, or Russia being weaker than or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think one of the things that some of the specialists didn't anticipate is, 2 things that happened with Ukraine as far as I've read. One is some of the learning that happened after 2014. So they got some military aid after 2014, but also there was some internal sort of learning. But also the kind of the catalytic effect that both 2014 had, but then this invasion had on their kind of public consciousness and identity, wanting to defend themselves. And so that's something that in some ways is kind of hard to anticipate before it happens, right? Are people going to come together, or are they going to fold in a situation like that? There's a lot of speculation now about Taiwan as to whether or not, if Taiwan was attacked directly tomorrow, like would they have that kind of catalytic reaction, or would they have more of a not my problem? They kind of like, okay, we surrender, take us over. So it's hard to anticipate beforehand exactly how that's going to play out. But certainly it's both. It's both that Russia is weaker than people thought, and that Ukraine was stronger than people thought. Because I remember, and that's what pretty much all the specialists at the time were saying was, it's going to be just a matter of time before Russia just wipes the floor with Ukraine and it's been absolutely the opposite.
Yeah. I think the thing that you mentioned about small scale stuff is, I think the thing that people who don't, like myself or others who maybe aren't paying like in the weeds as much, as we conflate the two of, they have great effectiveness in the small scale, like intelligence, small scale operations, and versus like a large scale actual invasion of a country. And those are actually not the same. But we are moving a bit. So I want to move on to the China-Taiwan thing. Because one of the things that people, let me pull up the list again real quick. But one of the things that people had mentioned when Russia invaded was that China is watching our response in, I wouldn't say necessarily preparation, but if they so chose to take an action against Taiwan, to see kind of how we would handle. And one of the things that I saw was they're watching the economic sanctions, and then somebody, I forgot who it was, somebody's like, well, if the US is playing 4D chess, maybe we're holding some in the back pocket for later. Is this sort of a testing ground for China? Is like, are they watching this in that sort of way? Are we at a risk for that? Or would you say maybe not as much as people seem to think?
Well, I think they're watching this scenario in lots of different ways, but yeah, I mean, I've just been uh, reading a really excellent book called The Long Game. Dashi is the author. And one of the things he talks about, which I'd read in other places, but how much the Chinese looked at the Persian Gulf War, the first Gulf War, the 1999 Kosovo War. Like they studied, and then the 2003 Iraq War. They study all these wars that the United States engages in for lessons, right? So they're constantly, in some ways it would be crazy for a country their size to not be learning lessons. So it's really just a question of what lessons they learn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And certainly there are some things that might give them pause, and there are things that might, not give them pause. So on the caution side, things that might lead them to be more cautious, I think it's been pretty darn surprising, and again, I think most specialists would agree with this. It's been pretty darn surprising how united the West has been in sanctioning Russia, and particularly the Europeans willing to really put themselves in a difficult place from an energy perspective for something that have a direct impact on them, right? So yeah, this is something that is concerning, and like I said, there's the moral outrage part. It's definitely a lot more concerning from kind of a security perspective for the Europeans than it is for us. But if you're Spain or Italy, right, you're kind of living your life, and suddenly, your gas prices, natural gas is through the roof, and you might not even be able to get some this coming winter. So those governments are willing to do some pretty courageous, if you think about it, politically courageous things relative to Russia. And so I think if you're China, one of the things you look at is you're like, okay, it may be, because I think this is probably the way that Xi Jinping sees the world, is like, maybe that we're going to have to do something militarily against Taiwan, but if we do, we're going to have to build in the cost of some pretty serious sanctions. That's going to happen. It's going to, and so they're probably thinking about that and looking at ways. It's not necessarily, I think this would be a mistake. They're not going to look at anything like this and say, oh yeah, I guess we're just not going to retake Taiwan, right?
Yeah.
All indicators are that is going to happen. It's just a question of time. The only thing that would lead it to not happen militarily is if Taiwan's, political system fundamentally changed and they said, "Oh, please, occupy us." So it's going to happen at some point in time, and I think the predictions are between now and 2049, which is the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party takeover.
Right.
Talked about that repeatedly. So that's on the economic sanction side. On the military side, I don't know how much learning, because it's a pretty different ballgame with Taiwan, where it's going to entail, amphibious assault and or blockade. It's way more important what they're doing right now, actually, from a learning perspective. They're learning these military exercises that they've been engaged in since the Pelosi visit. They're learning a ton from that, because they're normally their naval exercises are pretty tame and they're pretty limited, and they're engaging in live fire, very complex air and sea operations in the environment that they might have to stage in. So that's going to probably be as important, if not more important. Yeah.
Gotcha. So so I saw the news that Nancy Pelosi went there. Why did she, what was did they I didn't read much on it. So did the U.S. government give a purpose for that?
So, and this is a little fun feature of our political system, right? You know, the president of the United States can't really officially legally tell the Speaker of the House, like, do not go to Taiwan, right?
Right.
Now, based on the reporting, what Biden apparently did was said, please don't do this, Nancy. And she essentially said, F you. Now, in terms of why she did what she did, because from the Biden administration's perspective, this was potentially, you know, complicating things, potentially leading to a crisis, and they really didn't feel like it had any value add or benefit.
Well, that was the next question. So yeah.
Now, why did she do it? She has a long history personally of supporting Taiwan. She has a long history of criticizing China, and she's got a heavily, I guess, it's both Taiwanese American, but also Chinese American, but critical of Beijing constituency in her district. So, you know, some combination thereof. I also suspect very strongly from a timing perspective that she is seeing the writing on the wall, and she is expecting that she will not be Speaker of the House after November. So this is probably her last chance to do that. Yeah, I mean, we'll see whether it made me nervous because I was worried more than anything that they were talking about the possibility that China was going to, you know, try to escort her plane. And can you imagine if they accidentally, you know,
oh yeah, that would have been.
Yeah. But once she got in and out of there, so far I think it's been relatively tame, and probably more than anything that they're using this as a learning exercise. Now, just today, what I read is concern that they're essentially going to keep doing this indefinitely, like starting and finishing, and so using it as a way to limit Taiwan's ability to engage in normal air, you know, travel, naval,
yeah, it's almost like a pseudo blockade without actually calling it that.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I read the other day that there was some post on one of the China's like social media sites that said like prepare for war or something like that. And let's hypothetically move fast forward to like they're gonna do it like tomorrow. What is the U.S. Because China is a different animal from Russia from the standpoint of like, and also Taiwan is not as strong as Ukraine. So like what is the situation there? Are we in a position where public sentiment is like, we really don't want to do this? Like, yeah, it sucks, but like, sorry. Or is there other stuff that is potentially on the table that we could leverage?
Yeah, so fascinating question. I mean, first of all, I guess we could talk about okay, so one thing I think that is important maybe to set the ground with initially is and I'm trying to think at the moment, I apologize because I don't believe I have on the tip of my at the tip of my tongue the polling data on Taiwan questions specifically. But what you do have, and this is bipartisan in terms of elite sentiment in the United States, is a real consensus that China is a threat to the United States.
Yeah.
Republicans, Democrats, it's one of the rare things that they can agree on, and you can get legislation through that says, right, you know, we're concerned with China, we're doing X, Y, and Z in order to address the threat from China. So that's potentially in favor of more of a robust response. Biden has said numerous times, now this is a little tricky, but what he has said numerous times is that the U.S. would defend Taiwan if it were attacked in an unprovoked way. So, The U.S. is always very careful not to encourage Taiwan to declare independence. But if we're in this kind of gray zone status quo that we're in now, and China were to decide on its own to attack Taiwan, that the United States would come to its defense. Who knows what a future president, if the future president would have the same perspective. I kind of what I would bet though, given because you've alluded to this earlier with regard to Ukraine, and I think there is a general war fatigue or military intervention fatigue on behalf of the American people. So as much as they're opposed to China, I don't think they're looking for a war with a powerful country like China. So I suspect that what the U.S. would try to do is something more than what we're doing in Ukraine, but something that didn't bring us into full-scale war. And that would be really tricky to pull off in practice. But it would probably, that would be my best bet, at least under this administration. And then in a future administration,
who knows,
to see how things go. But again, my impression is that there's enough bipartisan criticism of China, skepticism of China as a threat to the United States, that Taiwan is, and you even saw this with the Pelosi visit, right?
Right.
She was actually, there were a lot of Republicans who gave her credit for going, which is again pretty rare for any Republican to ever say anything positive about Nancy Pelosi. So, so that gives you some sense of where the Republicans are on this.
Yeah, that's a bit interesting. I want to move that sort of bipartisan support into the unification of the American people. It seems like, I put this in the notes in the email as well, but it seems like we're kind of moving into another era, at least the way that history is taught and the way that I kind of segment it. It's like you've got World War I, World War II kind of era, and then you've got the Cold War era, and then you've got War on Terror, and it feels like we're moving into a new one that hasn't really been defined yet, but I feel like will be defined by the outcome of Ukraine and then whatever happens with Taiwan. And I worry from just my own living here is I don't really know. Well, I didn't live through the changing of eras from the world wars into the Cold War. I didn't live through that sort of era, and it seems nerve-wracking to a lot of people my age especially are like, dude, we don't know what's going on. Why are we giving this much money to Ukraine, or why are we doing this? Why are we sending people here? So I guess twofold is what are your thoughts on the eras of history? And then two, what is actually, I'll go with that. And the second one is going to be kind of I understand both the sentiment from people that are why are we still doing this? But then also the same sentiment, we don't have the same culture as other people. We don't have the same motivations as Putin or Xi. And they might want to, they have aspirations to take over Taiwan and other places. And at what points, we don't, it doesn't make sense to us, but that doesn't mean that they won't do it. So at that sort of weird balancing act that we have, there's a lot packed into that, but it's just thoughts that when I think about the US and its role in the world, that's kind of where I end up. It's why are we sending military when we have CIA operators, for example, who that's their job, that they want to do that? We can send somebody in to do something potentially, right? Obviously, given situations are different here and there, but what is our I guess to boil it down, entering into a new era of history, what are your thoughts on that? And then the U.S. role moving into this new sort of time.
Yeah. So, first of all, in terms of the new era, I think that's definitely, well, one thing to say is a little bit of an admission that it's often the case that when you're entering into a new era, you don't really know until you're 5 to 10 years into it. But I do suspect, as I've said a couple times already, that we are really just looking at the numbers. We are in an era of emergent bipolarity. So it's really going to be about the US and China. And by the way, one way that Russia still matters in that equation is the extent to which Russia is aligned with China, right? So US versus China, where Russia's a junior player in the Chinese camp, like China, at least for part of the Cold War. before they became more adversarial. So then, the current conflict also makes sense as, from that perspective. Now, there is certainly a massive debate in the United States, and I think will continue to be a massive debate in the United States about what we do in this bipolar world, right? So the kind of two polar opposites, and then maybe there are some variations. Yeah, I'll give you some variations, but might help kind of structure thinking a little bit to think about what some of the alternatives are. So there is a school that is kind of defending what we've always done, which is we have this system of alliances. We have it sometimes referred to as a grand strategy of deep engagement, where we have these alliances, we support our allies, we maintain those alliances, maybe even grow those a little bit in this new bipolar era. So, for example, there's this thing called the Quad, where the U.S. is trying to move toward an alliance with India. Would be an example of that option, right? It doesn't necessarily tell you where you are willing to fight, but it does tell you that you're going to stay engaged, right? There's an alternative grand strategy, which goes by some different names, but I'll use restraint because I think it's Barry Posen at MIT uses that term, and I think it's a really straightforward term to understand, which is that the U.S. pulls back from a number of its alliance obligations, right? Particularly in places like Europe, where, now the Europeans are all fired up about responding to Russia. Fine, let them deal with that. We don't need to be in the Middle East anymore because we got plenty of oil. Let the Middle East go. Don't need to be in Africa. Don't have any real problems in Latin America. Really only need to focus on China, right? And even then, the restraint people would say, we can do as little as we need to do to be able to defend ourselves, and maybe things like, the global commons. So, to be able to engage in naval commerce and those sorts of things. But, if China takes Taiwan, not my problem, right? Taiwan wants to defend itself, good for them. So, and of course there's lots of possibilities between those two, but that gives you some sense of where the debate is on kind of the big picture of where the United States is. Now, the second of those, the restraint, sounds in a way more like the Trump school, but what we saw when Trump was president was, because generally that restraint school goes with lower defense spending, but when in the Trump era, we had increased defense spending. So that's why I say that there's some variations and some different kind of possibilities within that.
Yeah.
But that gives you maybe in your listeners a little sense of kind of some of the big picture possibilities there. And I suspect we're going to continue to debate this as a society. The bringing in this, again, America First take on things, I think is going to make that an increasing part of our discussion, as well as the fact that China is probably going to continue to grow in power, and it's going to continue to get people's attention. So it's going to be the tension between those two, that on the one hand, people are like, hey, we kind of have done enough. We want to spend more on domestic things. We want to do less abroad. We don't want to be involved in foreign wars. But on the other hand, the more China grows and the scarier it gets, that tends to focus people on that problem.
Yeah, 100%. I think I see the merits to both of them. Like, we got problems here, but also there's problems abroad that we should probably deal with. I think, I don't know if we don't have to get into a long discussion on this because I know we got to wrap up in a minute, but I feel like we're going to end up with a lot of kind of similar proxy type wars. I'm not sure how. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. I don't really know how we'll go about doing that, because it seems to be towing the line a little bit between like provoking and not provoking, and I think we're going to be in one of those places where I hope it's not another Cold War type deal, but I don't know. Who knows? Do you have any quick thoughts on that before we wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, so if I had to bet at this point, I don't think there's anything that's inevitable here, but I do tend to think that we are headed toward a Cold War-like scenario. Why? So it really takes 2 to 3 things, depending on what you want to emphasize. One is the power situation, right? And we've already established that. So we are essentially verging on a bipolar structure in terms of power. So that's a critical initial ingredient. But the second critical ingredient is some sort of real conflict of interests. Now, last time there was an ideological conflict that I think is a lot less important this time. That's my take. I don't think ideology matters as much this time. But last time there was a conflict of interest, which is, the Soviet Union wanted to, expand, control a good chunk of the territory, expand in other places, was constantly looking for places to do that, and the US didn't want that. Well, what China wants, pretty clear from, again, most of the specialists, is China wants to essentially sort of erase what it sees as its century of humiliation by retaking Taiwan, by taking full control of the South China Sea. It's got border disputes with India. It's taken territory in Bhutan, right, that doesn't get a lot of press. China is not, I think one possibility to avoid all of this would be if China suddenly tomorrow was like, yeah, we're kind of done. We're good. Taiwan, you can go and be independent. That's not going to happen. So the alternative would be if the United States basically said, like I was suggesting before, if somebody, future president of the United States came along and was like, we don't care, you do what you want, not our problem. The extent to which the United States pushes back on any of that, and think about, for example, the South China, let's leave Taiwan aside. Think about the South China Sea, right? We have a treaty alliance with the Philippines. Chinese have, essentially claimed control over territorial waters that, international tribunal has said are the Philippines, right? So they've essentially taken, control of seas of one of our treaty allies that we are bound to protect. Well, at some point, the United States either has to back that ally up, or we have to essentially cut it loose and be like, no, sorry, JK didn't actually mean that alliance commitment that we made to you. So those are the kinds of scenarios that I think moving forward, they're not going to go away. As China grows, those things are probably going to multiply, those sort of interests. They're going to increasingly be looking for control of resources and basing points around the world, and that's going to bring them into more contact and more conflict with the United States. And so I sort of suspect that unless the U.S. adopted a pretty hardcore, okay, we care about defending our territory and nothing else, if we don't do that, we're going to get involved in some sort of clashes. And I think you're right, that there are likely to be these kind of proxy wars because, like in the Cold War, both sides have nuclear weapons. So unlikely that we're going to get into lots of direct conflict. It's going to be more low scale, indirect type of conflict.
Well, hopefully it stays low scale, indirect, and hopefully none at all, but we'll see. Your book, America's Entangling Alliances, in the description below, guys, for those listening. I really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Could talk forever about a lot of this stuff, but we're both busy people with things to do. So thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You bet, Eric. Take care.
Have a good one. See you guys later. Bye.